Okay, so if you're watching this video, you're receiving it because you were enrolled to participate in the talk on philosophy and masculinity, and you no doubt noticed that there was no audio in that on the online format of that presentation. On behalf of the organizers, I apologize for that. It's not that we didn't rehearse. We did come in the day previously and sort everything out meticulously and perfectly, and then we proceeded to get it wrong anyway. Hopefully we can make it right by making this presentation available to you now. What I'm going to do is just run through the talk again and narrate over the slides and just clip this together into a video and present the content in much the same format that would have been presented at the time. I'm going to do this talk extemporaneously. It's going to lack some of the polish that you would normally expect of a pre-authored video production, but given this is a stopgap or making amends for something that should have been delivered another way, hopefully it will be of acceptable quality just the same. Please forgive any umming and ahhing. Perhaps I'll say things in a way that isn't very articulate. You can use your imagination and fix it up yourself. I have great faith. So, philosophy and masculinity. We begin with the purpose of the talk. And the purpose is threefold. What various ideas and attitudes has philosophy adopted towards men and masculinity over the millennia? Now, an initial consideration. In that question it says men and masculinity. Those two things are conflated. It may be the perspective of some, perhaps many, that men and masculinity are not actually one and the same. That is to say that you could argue men are capable of being feminine and women are capable of being masculine. And I'd be the first to agree with you. That makes a lot of sense. And there are some philosophies and cultures that saw it in this way. What you have to understand from the outset, however, is that's actually a relatively novel interpretation. Generally speaking, in human history, men and masculinity were seen as one and the same. And therefore, if we want to understand a certain philosophy's attitude towards masculinity, we need to understand their attitude towards men. Throughout the course of this presentation, therefore, these terms will be used in different ways. Sometimes we'll be connecting them, the idea of men and masculinity, and sometimes we'll be consciously separating them. In fact, early on in this presentation, I'll be deliberately separating them so we can look at this in its constituent parts and look at it in a variety of ways. I'm going to be looking at masculinity in this presentation in three manners. The physical setup, maleness, you might say. The psychological setup, manhood, you might say. And then the spiritual setup. And we'll look at this as a kind of causal energy. Masculinity as a force of nature, if you like. That'll be one way we'll look at the problem. I'm going to throw a bunch of ideas around. But it begs the question, are any of these ideas and attitudes relevant in the 21st century? Of course, the world has changed. Even in my lifetime, when I was a child, the internet didn't exist, or it certainly wasn't widespread. And now look at us, that was just in my lifetime. Technology has shaped the world a great deal, and society has changed accordingly. Having said that, evolution doesn't work that fast. It's quite possible that a lot of the ideas from 2,000 to 3,000 years ago may still be relevant today. It's worth at least considering them. And most importantly, what, if any, philosophical pathways forward are there for men and masculinity? Now, an important consideration in the delivery of this talk is this. Citation does not necessarily imply endorsement. The format of this talk is like this. I'm going to be presenting a range of different philosophies from different cultural perspectives. We're going to be looking at the problem from a range of different perspectives. I've cherry-picked just a handful of small quotations that typify an overarching idea, an overarching sentiment within a philosophy, and we're going to use that to provide contrast. I have deliberately provided very different ideas, right? It's not one cohesive argument, it's a range of perspectives that we're going to consider each in turn. Having said that, you may find that some of the ideas you don't particularly agree with. Some of the ideas I don't particularly agree with. But this talk isn't about what I think and what I agree with. This talk is on philosophy and masculinity. So just keep that in mind. If there's something that you don't like, citation does not necessarily imply endorsement. If you don't like an idea, feel free to disregard it. Now, at this point in the presentation, I asked the participants in the audience, I asked them to get a feel, I wanted to get a feel for the sentiment in the room, and I said, how many, raise your hand if you feel that in the year 2025, masculinity is in something of a sorry state? And 95% of the room raised their hands. Only one or two people didn't seem to move. And I don't even know if they understood the question. The next thing I asked was, I chose some people. I said, how long would you say this has been a problem? To your estimation, just have a wild guess. Is this a recent thing or a long-term thing? I got a bunch of answers, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 15 years, 20 years, 40 years. There was an elderly lady, she might have been in her 80s or something, and she said, oh, I think longer. She just mumbled that. But generally the sentiment was sometime this century, you would say. Sometime this millennia. I have a quote here from Thomas Carlyle. He is a Scottish philosopher, and he said this of masculinity, that the old ideal of manhood has grown obsolete and the new is still invisible to us, and we grope after it in the darkness. Fair enough. That's a sentiment that I think a lot of people would understand. But what's interesting about this quote is not so much what he said, but when he said it. You see, Thomas Carlyle penned these words in 1831. What this suggests, of course, that this is not exactly a recent phenomenon. This has been something going on for quite some time. A lot of people have been wondering just that. Now we introduce the idea of definitions. What do we even mean? What does it mean when you say the word masculinity? Of course, it means something different to different people, but there are different ways that we can fundamentally look at the phenomenon. One of the ways I'd like to look at it by way of offering or suggestion is the idea of a causal force or a causal energy. In physics, they teach us that there are 4 causal forces that make up all of the physical phenomena that we behold in the universe: electromagnetism, gravity, and the weak and strong nuclear forces. They make up everything that we behold, at least at our current state of knowledge. You could look at masculinity in something of the same way, and that might sound a little bit new agey, it might sound a little bit convoluted, but consider this as by way of example, things that we can observe as philosophers in the natural world, and to try to understand the forces that do form the world around us. We have a tiger, and he's having a lovely stretch. And the lion, he is quite enjoying a morning stretch. It's the best way to start the day, and the leopard agrees. But most importantly, so too does the domestic cat. Right. What we see here is 4 very different kinds of cat. Their evolutionary pathways have bifurcated thousands of years ago, and they're different creatures now. However, we do see an underlying nature. You could call this feline nature, right? It is something like to be feline. There is a nature to these creatures, even if the creatures themselves really are quite different on the surface. Let's go a little bit deeper with our analysis and consider the idea of attributes and traits. This is a claw from an eagle from the aviary kingdom. This is the barb from a scorpion from the arachnid kingdom. This is the thorn from a rosebush from the plant kingdom. And of course, the hero of this talk, the domestic cat. 4 very different kinds of living organism. One of them isn't even sentient. But even in the plant, we see one underlying trait. trait aggression. Okay? There is a causal force at play. There's some aspect or behavior that is necessitated from living organisms that shapes the physical world. It shapes it in a very particular way. And if this is true of feline nature, if this is true of certain traits like aggression, could this also be true of masculinity? Is there a nature to masculinity? Are there fundamental traits or attributes that we could describe as masculine that are shaping the physical world? This is one of the ways we're going to look at the problem in this presentation. A little bit boring, but we have to consider the dictionary definition. What does it even mean? What does masculinity mean? The Oxford Dictionary says, qualities or attributes regarded as characteristic of men or boys. Okay. How about sociology? Sociology is another way that you could look at this problem. We have a quote here from Michael Flood, a professor of sociology at QUT up in Queensland. He says that masculinity refers to the roles, behaviors, and attributes seen as appropriate for boys and men in a given society. In short, masculinity refers to society's expectations of males. Okay? So we're talking about a nature, we're talking about attributes, we're talking about characteristics. One of them is an intrinsic definition, what we might expect, well, what we might imagine male creatures to be, and the other is an extrinsic definition. What is it that society wants men to be? What does it want and need? Okay. You also saw in these examples, however, that notice again how men and masculinity are conflated. Right? They're seen as one and the same. I'd like to take a moment now. This is, of course, one legitimate way of looking at it, and many people do, and you're free to do so. But I'd like to take a moment to separate these phenomena, separate the phenomenon of masculinity and the phenomenon of malehood, and consider those things as constituent parts. In order to do this, we're going to look at Chinese philosophy, and in particular, we're going to look at the philosophy of Taoism. Now, you may or may not be familiar with Taoism, but you've almost certainly come across this in your travels. It is a yin and yang. Taoism is a philosophy started by the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu about 2,500 years ago. Lao Tzu wrote a book called the Tao Te Ching, and in it he wrote his observations of the universe and his philosophy. It became one of the two most influential philosophies of China, the other being Confucianism. Lao Tzu saw a universe of duality. When he looked out into the world, he saw everything was on a spectrum of two opposing things. Where there was night, there was day. Where there was life, there was death. Where there was creation, there was destruction. Where there was masculine, there was feminine. All things were upon this spectrum, and nothing existed in isolation. Where there was yang, there was always a little bit of yin, and when there was yin, there was always a bit of yang. The yin and yang translate into English like this. Yin is the primordial feminine. It was the black part of the yin and yang, and the yang was the primordial masculine, the white part of the yin and yang. In this tradition, an important consideration before I continue, this does not mean male and female. It does not mean men and women, okay? Men are capable of harnessing yin energy, women are capable of harnessing yang energy. However, there is a tendency. Male creatures do tend towards yang energy, and female creatures do tend towards yin energy. Not just humans, all creatures. We'll examine this in just a moment. But you do have to separate the idea of sex and causal energy. They're separate phenomena, okay? And the yin and yang is just that causal energy, right? Long before the downstream physical manifestations. What were some of the properties of the yin and yang? It's retractive versus expansive, passive versus active, following versus leading, and attracting versus seeking. That might sound a little bit convoluted, but I'll rope it down with an example from the physical world. We'll just stick with plants. Plants are a good example because they obey the laws of yin and yang. They follow the laws, they're influenced by them, you would say. But you're not roping in more complex matters such as sentience and consciousness and culture and society and all these other things that would add layers to it. Let's just keep it simple for now and look at plants. Even in plants, we see the yin and yang paradigm at play. there's a male and female part of a plant, and the male part of the plant goes out into the world. It is seeking. The seed will fall from the tree onto the ground. The seed will be blown by the wind, or the pollen will be blown by the wind out into the world. It'll be eaten by the bird and passed in its droppings long, long way away. And the female part of the plant is selecting. It's receiving, and it's passive and attracting, right? It tries to attract the bees, it tries to attract the birds, it's trying to receive the seed. All of this is done in the name of diversity, because diversity helps living creatures survive. And we see a fundamental balance of the yin and yang energies in this behavior of plants. It scales up to sentient creatures as well. Male sentient creatures do tend to initiate and go out and seek, and female creatures do tend to select. All things having exceptions, however. These are not hard and fast rules. It's often characterized as dark and light, and moon and sun. The French word for the moon is la lune. The French word for night is la nuit. They are both feminine nouns. The day is le jour, and the sun is le soleil. They are both masculine nouns. It turns out this same characterization occurs in every Latin-based language, right? It's not a matter of good and bad. It could be tempting to sort of see one of the energies as a good force and one of the energies as a bad force. That's not the way that it works. Instead, both the energies are capable of producing goodness and badness as it would be perceived by a human being. In the case of the yin, it's creating energy. In the case of the yang, it's sustaining energy, regulation, if you like. In the case of yin, the negative energy would be destruction, and the yang energy would be tyranny. Lao Tzu observed that creation and destruction were two sides of a coin. As the expression goes in English, if you want to make an omelette, you got to break a few eggs. If you're going to make a painting, you're going to make a big old mess. When a woman gives birth, it does terrible damage to her body. It seems to be the nature of creation that it requires a certain degree of chaos and destruction. And so this was two sides of the same energy. Yang energy was said to bring order to things, to bring order to chaos, to bring regulation. However, excessive regulation, excessive order tends to snuff out the life of something, right? It manifests as tyranny. In the attempt to regulate, nothing exists anymore. This will be relevant to our conversation about masculinity later on in this talk when we talk about the wall. Mind that thought. I have a quote here from Alan Watts, and he's speaking to this excessive yang energy. He says, the more a thing tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless, right? This speaks to the necessity of a balance between energies. Rather than it being a matter of good and bad, it's a matter of balance and imbalance. Yin energy was said to be nourishing, yang was said to be supportive. Yin was said to be egalitarian and kind, yang was said to be competitive or mean. Yin energy was amplifying and yang energy was generating. This is a little bit convoluted, so I'll break this down with an example. The textbook example of this they give you in the tradition is the male energy initiates, the male energy provides, the female energy receives, amplifies, and upgrades. The textbook example being, you give a woman one sperm, just one little seed, and she incubates, amplifies, upgrades, and 9 months later you get back a baby, right? And this tends to be a general pattern within nature. In the tradition, in the Taoist tradition, they say teaching is masculine and being a student, like learning, is feminine. Nothing to do with sex. In Australia, there are far more female teachers than male teachers. This is not a sex thing, but the energy, the idea of initiating an idea, providing an idea, that's like planting a seed in the mind of your students, and they amplify and they generate and they upgrade and they become larger and more powerful in that idea, and will end up surpassing the teacher. Right? This is a yin and yang paradigm from the perspective of Taoism. Physicality and representation, it manifests in the world. Yin as soft and flowing, yang as firm and rigid. Okay, and you can see this. You can see this in the world. The classic example they give of yin is the water or the sea, right? Earth and nature and the ocean are very often characterized in the feminine, right? And that's because of some of these primordial qualities that we've been identifying, the idea of creating life, of nourishing, right? This is the positive side of the yin energy. And this is why we have ideas like Mother Nature and Mother Earth. Gaia is a feminine god. In the Romance languages, they refer to the ocean as the mother, quite literally. This speaks to its capacity to provide. Of course, there's another side of the coin. There's dysentery, there is bushfires, earthquakes, right? Diseases, and all forms of natural destruction that tear the earth apart, right? This characterization is seen routinely across culture and in the physical world. We can also see it in the activities of human beings. Consider this, the semiotics of representation. This is one of those convoluted academic terms that I learned when I was back at art school. I work commercially as an artist, and when I was back at university 15 years ago, they taught us this idea. Semiotics is just a fancy word for meaning. And what they mean is there is so much meaning imbued with the way that you present something. It is rich with cultural subtext, it is rich with biological subtext, it is rich with a relationship context. There's so much that can be extrapolated from the way you place imagery to an audience, right? We're going to look at this through the lens of semiotics to understand how we might look at the world in this way, and more importantly, how we might analyze it and use it to our advantage. Consider this example from contemporary culture. We have the genie and Jafar from Aladdin. An important note, both male characters, all right? Again, this has got nothing to do with sex. This is a classic yin and yang paradigm. One of the characters is high yin, one of the characters is high yang. I'll dial up the energy so that you can look at the image the way that I look at the image. It looks like this. Perhaps now you can guess. The genie on the left, that's high yin. Jafar on the right, he's high yang. This is not a coincidence. It is a conscious design choice because the artists at Disney figured this out a long time ago. They figured out the causal level of human emotions, and if you understand them, you can manipulate them. The genie is a good guy. Why is he a good guy? Because he literally wants to give you what you wish. He just wants everybody to get along. He is egalitarian, he is kind, he's not at all competitive, he's a good guy. And so they dial up the yin energy, and you know in a flash, even a child sees this image and says, "Ah, yeah, I like him." Jafar's the opposite. He is a bad guy. Why is he a bad guy? He's competitive. He wants power and he wants it all to himself, and he doesn't care what other people think. So they dial up the yang energy, make him firm and rigid and more towards that masculine energy. And again, even a child in a flash knows, bad guy, right? Same goes for the Jungian archetypes that they played with in The Lion King. The benevolent king versus the tyrannical king in Mufasa and Scar. Same thing, a yin and yang paradigm. Mufasa is higher in yin energy. He's still a very masculine character, but he's high in yin energy because he's a loving and benevolent king. He's more egalitarian. He cares about those beneath him. Scar's the opposite. He's highly competitive. He wants power all to himself. He's a bad guy. So they dial up that yang energy. He becomes more angular and more firm and rigid, and your emotions find it very easy to hate him as a result. It even works for female characters, right? On the left from Lilo and Stitch, this is a couple of orphans. They're just trying to raise a family. They want everybody to get along. Stitch is a boy, but he's androgynous. He's a good guy, so he gets soft as well. Isma on the right. She's actually from the Emperor's New Groove, but she's a bad guy, right? Why is she a bad guy? She's competitive. She wants the power of the Emperor, and she wants it all to herself, and she doesn't care what other people think. And again, same thing. You dial up the yang energy, you make it more firm and rigid, you got a bad guy. Now, as artists, we learn to work on this causal level to get the effect that you want. In the world of entertainment, you would call this storytelling. In the world of capitalism, we call it marketing. In the world of politics, we call this propaganda, right? All of this speaks to a kind of control. If we as artists can understand the causal energy that animates our emotions, does it not follow that we as human beings or philosophers, we can understand the causal level of emotion and work with those things to get the kinds of outcomes that we want? And that's how this might apply to masculinity. To bring that all into a practical idea, consider the Book of Changes or the Yi Jing. They introduced this idea called Nei Wei, right? And the Nei Wei overlays over the yin and yang. In English, it translates as the inside, outside, or familiar exploratory demarcation. And what's meant by this is that we form a kind of spiritual or energetic posture. And the instruction goes like this. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. The instruction is that we rest in the Nei, in the feminine energy, in the inside, in the familiar, right? In the egalitarian, in the kind, and that we move out into the Wei, right? Into the yang energy, outside exploratory, to take what is necessary to shape the world the way we see, to take what we need to survive, and then you move back into the feminine, back into Nei, back into inside, back into familiar. And in this sense, it actually becomes a movement inside and outside of yin and yang energy, right? Back to the soft and flowing and familiar, out into the hard and rigid and competitive, and then back again. That it's not so much a matter of being masculine or feminine, but that there is a balance between these energies to play to their respective strengths. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts it like this. The inside-outside spatial demarcation doesn't mean that Nei is inferior to Wei. On the contrary, Nei is the focus center on which one anchors in order to proceed to or retract from the Wei. From the Shijing Shujing, the highest accolade for a benevolent ruler is called the father and mother of the people, or a minzifumu. This is indicative of parental parity. While the roles were starkly different in Chinese society of men and women, that didn't necessarily mean one was superior or inferior to the other. They were simply different. Lao Tzu says simply the instruction in the Tao Te Ching, know the masculine, but keep to the feminine. And elsewhere, a different philosophy, but speaks to this idea. Confucius says in Analects, by nature we are similar. It is learned habits that set us apart. The idea being here that this is not who you are. This is something that you're doing, and you can change what you're doing to achieve different results. In summary, in Chinese philosophy, energy is universal. It is both formative and responsive. It influences your behavior, but it also responds to your commands. Consciousness is the key to unlocking that manipulation. There is an emphasis on balance rather than the supremacy of one or the other. The yin energy, the feminine energy, is seen as the default, and yang, masculine energy, is to be used as needed. Okay, so we've considered it as an energy, we've considered it as a spiritual force. We're now going to look at it in a very different way. I'd like to consider the physical side, the physicality of masculinity that you may call maleness, as this is clearly a relevant dimension to the conversation around masculinity. We're going to do this by considering Plato's shoulders, right? Plato was not Plato's real name. Plato was a nickname. Plato's real name was Aristocles, not to be mistaken for Aristotle, who was one of his students. Plato means broad or wide in ancient Greek. And they called Plato Plato because he was said to have the widest shoulders in all of Athens. You see, Plato was a bodybuilder. He really liked wrestling. And in order to get good at wrestling, his competitive sport, he went to a place that the Greeks called a gymnasium. The gymnasium means the place where you train naked. Don't do that. To the ancient Greeks, you will see a very common theme that there is something expected of men and masculinity. If what the sociologist said was true, that masculinity refers to society's expectations of males, it is certainly the case that there is a physical dimension to what was expected of men and masculinity over the millennia. Consider these quotes from Socrates. It's worth mentioning that these quotes don't come from the work of Plato, they actually come from the work of Xenophon, but they are attributed to Socrates himself. And he says this of masculinity: No man should be an amateur in physical training. Indeed, it is a disgrace to grow old through sheer carelessness before seeing what manner of man you may become by developing your bodily strength and beauty to their highest limit. But you cannot see that if you are careless, for it will not come of its own accord. He says elsewhere, I tell you, just because the city does not publicly train for war, you must not make that an excuse for being any less careful in attending to it yourself. This might seem a little counterintuitive. It's not the kind of image of Socrates that we tend to present, philosophically speaking. A lot of people don't know this about Socrates, but Socrates was a soldier, right? He killed people. He fought in at least 4 wars that we know of, including the Peloponnesian War against the Spartans, right? And he certainly would have seen a lot of people die. This no doubt shaped his view of the world and his philosophy, right? Throughout the work of Socrates, you would see a generally pretty disparaging attitude to what people were sophists at the time. You might think of this as an armchair philosopher, the kind of person who sits back in the comfort of their home and pontificates about the way the world ought to be and the way humans ought to be without any bearing on reality, right? He was very disparaging of this kind of philosophy. You'll see also in Greek philosophy, or in Greek culture, I beg your pardon, a very particular masculine archetype. Now, here's a couple of examples, here's a couple of more, and here's a couple more, right? Yikes, this is a very particular kind of masculinity that was clearly prized very, very highly. Again, you have to look at it within the cultural substrate at the time to understand what was going on. Ancient Greek wasn't actually a state in the sense that you might think of it in the modern sense. It was just a collection of cities. There were 10 or 12 cities that had a similar cultural bend, and they had a trading relationship and so forth. They had porous borders, and they were constantly defending themselves against threats, in particular the Persians, right? If you are constantly dealing with warfare, it becomes an important part of your society to produce warriors, which in those days would have required men, and a certain kind of man in order to fight the wars. Socrates looked over at the border in Sparta, and he saw a society that was entirely focused on producing the finest warriors, and they were very good at that. And what Socrates was curious about was, could you make a society that was focused on producing the finest philosophers? Could you tilt things in that way, right? I'd like to introduce Thucydides at this point. Thucydides was a historian come philosopher in ancient Greece. He is the darling of the American military. They simply love this guy for his brooding militaristic quotations. Consider some of these by way of example. The society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools, right? This is a reasonably common enough theme. It's gentler in later manifestations of the philosophy like Stoicism that we'll be discussing in just a few moments. But this idea that there needs to be a physical side to the human being as well as an intellectual side. That those things don't want to become too far separated from each other, right? He says elsewhere, to you who would call yourselves men of peace, I say you are nothing without men of action by your side, right? You can see why the American military like him so much. No aspect of power more impresses men than its exercise with restraint. Okay, so it's not just a matter of being super powerful, but being self-control, that you would develop your physical sense out of a sense of discipline, but also self-respect. But most importantly, you develop your physical self out of a duty to the state, out of duty to something higher, right? And that you would learn that self-control so that you would be a rounded human being, not simply a physical human being or not simply an intellectual human being, that you really needed both, right? So in Greek philosophy, in summary, there is an importance of physical discipline, the idea of self-control leading to self-respect, and of course, a duty to the state. We see similar ideas echoed in Roman philosophy if we pop across the border, moving a little bit later in time, and the philosophies have evolved a little bit. There's an old-fashioned Latin expression that you'll sometimes see in doctors' clinics, mens sana in corpore sano. It just translates as a strong mind and a strong body, and it could be a low-resolution summary of what you see in Roman philosophy. We'll start with Seneca of the Stoics. Seneca was actually born in what we now think of as Spain, but he spent most of his life in Rome. And in Letters to Lucilius, he says a bunch of things that are relevant to our exploration. The body should be treated more rigorously, that it may not be disobedient to the mind. This is a very common theme in Stoic philosophy, right? The Stoics had this idea that if you can't control this corporeal matter, if you can't regulate this, you have no way in hell of controlling this. The body was seen as a stepping stone to regulation of the mind, right? He says elsewhere, without philosophy the mind is sickly, and the body too, though it may be very powerful, is strong only as that of a madman or a lunatic is strong. He's speaking to temperance here, that he doesn't just want Lucilius, the man he's writing to, a younger man, a much younger man, to just focus on the physicality. That yes, okay, you can get stronger, but you'll be nothing more than an animal at this point, that you need to focus on philosophy. He says here, manliness gains much strength by being challenged. So clearly he sees manliness as a particular phenomenon, and that it's worth doing this, and that it requires challenge to do so. However, he issues an instruction here of temperance or regulation. He says to the young man, indeed it is foolish and very unsuitable for a cultivated man to work hard, overdeveloping the muscles and broadening the shoulders and strengthening the lungs. Accordingly, limit the flesh as much as possible and allow free play to the spirit. In the broader context of that quote, what he says is something, he's writing to Lucilius, who's like 40 years younger than him, and Lucilius is a young bodybuilder. A lot of guys at the time were interested in getting strong, and they saw it as their duty. And Seneca says, look, yes, you can do this, but it will require you to eat a great deal of food in order to maintain the muscle and the tissue and all the rest of it. You're going to be tired all the time from all the digesting. You're going to need to sleep a lot. And he makes this pithy comment. He says, in the end of the day, you'll never be stronger than an ox. And what he's saying to the young man is like, yes, by all means, work on your strength and work on your discipline, but know that you're not actually a beast of burden. You'll never be an incredibly strong creature because that's not your nature. It's not your role, right? So there is a kind of balance to this, to the physical side. They clearly saw this as an important thing, but don't take your eye off the ball of philosophy, right? That was ultimately far more important. We see a similar sentiment echoed in the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. Seneca was a contemporary of Jesus, and Marcus Aurelius came about 170 years later, something like 200 years later, and he was the emperor of Rome and perhaps one of the most famous Stoics in history. And he says this of men and masculinity in his work on Meditations. From the reputation and remembrance of my father, modesty and a manly character. What's a manly character? A man must keep himself pure from all violent passion and evil affection, from all rashness and vanity, and from all manner of discontent, either in regard to the gods or men. Be free and consider all things as a man whose proper object is virtue, as a man whose true nature is to be a kind and sociable, as a citizen and as a moral creature. You are a man, do not be diverted from yourself, and speak that which seems most just, and speak it kindly, modestly, and without hypocrisy. Consider that to be angry is not the part of a man, but that to be meek and gentle, as it savours more of humanity, and so more of manhood. Not a word about physicality in there. Not a word about strength. Marcus Aurelius' battle was an internal battle, and again, you have to understand the context of the philosopher's life and the society to know what was going on to understand the philosophy. Socrates was a soldier. Marcus Aurelius was a commander. Most of his life he was at war, Marcus Aurelius. It was one of the things that got him down, but he wasn't actually on the front lines. It wasn't necessary for him to be physically strong to be able to overcome someone. His role was different. He was bestowed with incredible power, and what he was mostly concerned about was not becoming corrupt. It follows then, if you understand this about the man, that mostly what he was concerned about was dissecting himself, to see the nature of creature that he was, and to make sure that he remained good and virtuous. It was absolutely wonderful. But this is also perhaps more relevant because so often in the modern context in the 21st century, the kinds of challenges that men will be facing are probably less to do with their physical strength and more to do with the demands upon their character. However, those things may be related. So, in summary, we see the idea of emotional equanimity, especially non-anger. Anger is seen as absolutely detrimental to masculine character. Masculine character is honest, kind, and gentle. It is manly and virtuous, but modest in those things. There is some emphasis on physical discipline. However, philosophy and the cultivation of mind are ultimately considered more important than physicality. I want to bounce off Judeo-Christianity a little bit to add some contrast here, to add some interest. I also really want to speak to the idea of societal expectations of men and boys. If masculinity is society's expectations of men and boys, you will see this, what has the Bible had to say about this? How would people have been interpreting this? Here's just a few cherry-picked quotes to give us a little bit of flavor, give a bit of feel for it. From the book of Corinthians, be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. He charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth, be thou strong therefore, and show thyself a man. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. But as for you, O man of God, flee these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. From the book of Kings, be strong, act like a man. And from the book of Proverbs, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. Look, in the preparation of this talk, it took me 12 months. I read so much, I watched so much, I listened to so much. I can assure you, no matter the culture, no matter the society, the expectations of men and boys have been absolutely incontrovertible. The incontrovertible truth was that they expect strength and courage. And what's more is they generally want you to shut up. They want you to be strong and courageous and quiet, right? This absolutely seems to be what society has expected from men or boys, and it has no doubt shaped what we understand to be masculinity. In summary, it is emotionally equanimous. We are seeing an echo from the Roman philosophy. A lot of the Roman philosophy was built in, ancient Greek and Roman philosophy was built in to the Judeo-Christian religion. Loving and gentle, strong and courageous. And of course, it's a religion. So faithful, believing in justice and God, you're going to expect that from a religion. Similar idea in Islam. Islam is complicated. The Quran doesn't actually say much about men and masculinity. It's interestingly quiet on that subject, but I wanted to explore this, and I found some interesting quotes from the leaders of the caliphates in the 7th century that might help us get our finger on the pulse of what was the original intent. Before all the other stuff happened and it kind of went the way that it went, what was the original spirit of the venture? And I found a couple of quotes that I thought were really useful. The first one comes from the ruler of the 2nd caliphate. He said this: men ought to view themselves as composed of a mind, body, and soul, and to consistently work to improve each dimension of their inner being, especially their inner character. The same guy says elsewhere, the foundation of a man is his intellect, his honor in his religion, and his manhood in his character. In the Islamic tradition, they split virtue up into a spiritual plane and a physical plane, and they have different cardinal virtues, right? Different cardinal qualities. In the physical plane, there's this word in Arabic, it's muruwa. And muruwa translates into English as manliness, but it doesn't mean in the physical sense. It means like a kind of virtuous masculine character. So when you see this word here, and his manhood and his character, this is no doubt a translation of the word muruwa in Arabic. A different ruler that came a little bit later said this: verily, Allah commands justice and excellence. Justice is to have a sense of fairness, and excellence is to prefer others to yourself. What remains of manhood after this? No doubt that word muruwa coming up again. The number there, 1690, is a reference to a chapter verse in the Quran, but he's breaking those things apart. This idea of preferring others to yourself, the idea of sacrifice, is something that we'll see echo over into contemporary thought in just a moment. But in summary, we are spiritual and physical beings. There is an emphasis on a virtuous masculine character, and that looks something like just, honorable, and benevolent. And of course, it's a religion, so godliness and having faith is going to be a cardinal virtue of any religion. Some contemporary thought. How am I going for time? Cool. Okay, so I'll introduce you to David Dieter. We're going to look at some contemporary philosophers to see if we can't find some echoes from earlier times and earlier traditions. David Dieter wrote a bunch of books, one of which was called The Way of the Superior Man. And he said this of sacrifice: fearlessness, or the capacity to transcend the fear of death for the sake of love, is a quintessential form of the ultimate masculine gift. This is the center of the bullseye. Now, the goodness of such action is a separate consideration, because sacrificing yourself to promulgate some religion, or to bring someone to justice, or maybe to stop the Nazis, these are very different sacrifices. We're just talking about the act of sacrifice itself, and don't worry about the good and bad, that's a separate conversation. But what he's suggesting is that this capacity to value yourself and your life lower than something more valuable is intrinsically masculine, in fact the ultimate masculine manifestation. That makes a lot of sense if you look at it through the lens of societal expectations of men and boys. There's this word in Japanese, the word's karoshi. Taking a step back, stopping Nazis and dying on the battlefront may be the most dramatic form of sacrifice, but if we look at this through the lens of a more modern lens, this still happens. Men are still doing this, but perhaps in a less dramatic form. The Japanese word I was talking about is karoshi. Karoshi means a man collapsing at his desk and dying from working too hard. That phenomenon was so common in their culture that they had to come up with a word for it. And karoshi is the modern sacrifice that many men are making. It's not so much that they're literally dying, it's that they're giving up their time and their choices and their life force to protect and provide for their family, for something that they value higher than themselves. This is a modern manifestation of this phenomenon, and it's an intrinsic part of masculine psychology. And I'll give you an example to rope that down and to solidify it. When I was 14, I was in high school, and I was really interested in history, I beg your pardon, in particular modern history at the time. And they were teaching us about the First World War between 1914 and 1918. A war that was characterized by trench warfare. And what the men would do is that they'd come out of the trenches, over the parapets, into what they called no man's land, and they'd be facing machine gun fire, artillery bombardment, landmines, barbed wire, noxious gases. The odds of survival were extremely low. And at the time, as a 14-year-old, I was so confused. I thought, why did they do it? Were they stupid? Like, all they have to do is, there weren't that many officers, there was so many more infantry. All they had to do was just say, nah, mate, I'm not doing that. They've all got rifles, you can't make me. Why don't they just all band together and head off for lunch at the pub? But you see, at this point, at the age of 14, I didn't understand a fundamental attribute, a characteristic of men and masculine psychology, and the attribute is this. Most men would rather face certain death than shame. All right, one more time for influence. It's very important. It'll come up later in the talk. It's a critical point this talk rests on. Most men would rather face certain death than shame. We need to understand this if we're going to have any control over men and masculinity. This is Warren Farrell. He was one of the first famous male feminists. He wrote feminist literature in the 70s and 80s. He later wrote books in the 90s and 2000s on issues that are affecting boys and men. He now considers himself a gender rights activist. He sort of works for both sides. He wrote a book called The Boy Crisis, and he says this: the discipline of postponing gratification is the single most important discipline your son needs. This is really, really good work. You see, this echoes some of the sentiment we were hearing from the Greeks and from the Romans about the idea of self-awareness and self-control. It's like discipline is the discrimination and the capacity to act on the realization of what you want most and what you want now. You need to be able to discriminate between those things, but also have the tools to get to what you want most. Because generally, people can see what they want, they just can't get past the malaise of short-term desire, right? Now, you could make the argument, and I'd be the first to agree with you, that this is a predicate of all maturation. Every mature adult needs to learn the postponement of gratification. That's true. However, this is particularly salient for boys and men, because when things go wrong for boys and men, they go catastrophically wrong, right? They don't tend to go down alone. right? Men have this intrinsic capacity. They can be really quite dangerous. If they don't learn to regulate their emotions, if they don't learn it early and figure out what it is that they really want, things can go really, really wrong for them and the people around them, right? It does make it a somewhat gendered issue, or particularly critical for boys and men, right? He says elsewhere, the trading of wit-covered put-downs is boys and men training each other to handle criticism, unconsciously knowing that the ability to handle criticism is a prerequisite to success. This is another really great idea. So, and I think it's often misunderstood, especially by women, because women don't necessarily interact with each other in this way. You know, I have some friends and we train together at the gym, and the way I let those guys know that it's great to see them and I've missed them is I'll insult their mother and I'll insult their sister, right? I'll say something really heinous to them, and I say that to them because they know I love you so much that I can say all this horrible stuff to you and you don't care. It just bounces off you. I love you so much that I want you to be strong. I want you to be successful, right? And this is what's been expected of men. It's what's been expected of boys, that they need to protect and to provide. And to do that, you need to be tough. But it's not just a matter of being tough. You see, that's not good enough either. Because, you know, as Johnny Cash said, you know, this world is rough, and if a man's got to make it, he's got to be tough. But he also needs to be light-hearted. It's not enough to simply grit your teeth and bear with the extraordinary weight of responsibility crushing you into the ground and just, you have to tell you if I have to, because that's not pleasant to be around. And one of the most useful tools that you can develop is a sense of humor, a sense of play. If you can't tolerate being called funny names, well, you're just not going to be flat out tough enough to handle the kinds of problems you're going to have. And as boys, when we love each other and we're well-oriented in the world, we want each other to be strong. Of course, there's measure in this, and we're going to talk about measure later in the talk, because it can become bullying if you get the measure wrong. However, the fundamental phenomenon is absolutely critical to the development of a masculine character and to fulfill the kinds of expectations and obligations that society will place upon us. The Austrian oak, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Absolutely extraordinary guy. He says this simply in his book, Be Useful: stay busy, be useful. Pithy, but fantastic advice. And I think this is so important, and I'll break down why I think that is. Taking a step back, in the Western countries, in the last 10 years, the male suicide rate has gone up 40%. Right, and this is just the ones that we can record. It's no doubt indicative of a much larger problem beneath the surface. Men are now 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women, 3 times more likely to die of deaths of despair, 20 times more likely to be killed and seriously injured at work. If you look at divorced men in isolation, they are 9 times more likely to die by suicide than the rest of the population. There's a reason for this, or so it seems. To understand the reason, I'll introduce you to Fiona Shan here, a research associate at the University of Amsterdam. She did some incredible, noble, but macabre work to understand this phenomenon. She was actually analyzing suicide letters of men and women to try to understand what's going on. This only happened recently. This was like in 2023. And I don't know how she got the letters, but she did. And she was looking for recurring themes. Where does it go fundamentally wrong? And she pieced out 2 recurring themes in female suicide and 2 recurring themes in male suicide. And they were different. In women, it was unbearable pain and feeling unloved. In men, it was, I am useless, I am worthless, right? And it's so interesting that Schwarzenegger identified, let's say, the zenith as being useful and being busy, because he wasn't aware of this research, right? The research came after he wrote that book. It's so interesting that he saw this as the triumphant way of orienting yourself to be useful, when we can see from the analysis of suicide letters that the nadir, the absolute bottom of the masculine condition, could be considered uselessness, to be perceived as worthless. Now, to be clear, I'm not making a philosophical statement about what a man is or isn't useful, because of course, philosophically speaking, we are all worthy of love and we can manifest love in the world, but that's not what this conversation is about. This is more of a sociological and physical conversation, not so much of a spiritual or philosophical one, right? At this point, this is more how the men perceive themselves. How can we keep men and boys away from those walls, as far away from uselessness as possible? We're going to consider that in a moment, but first, the wall. I interviewed a bunch of people for this talk to try and get my finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist, men and women, old and young, gay and straight, to try and get a different feel for things. They had different ideas. The most common theme I found from women, the most common objection women had to men and masculinity was this idea, the idea of the wall. And the wall is an emotionally shut down and ineffective man, right? Who has solidified his emotions in a way of dealing with his pain. And you would see this as the increase of yang energy, right? The more something tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless, right? That's solidifying. Consider these quotes. One's from Vivekananda, and it helps illustrate the problem that women were identifying, that I spoke to. There are men who are never attached by anything. They can never love. They are hard-hearted and apathetic. They escape most of the miseries of life, as the wall never feels misery. The wall never loves and is never hurt. It is a wall, after all. Surely it is better to be attached and caught than to be a wall. Therefore, the man who never loves, who is hard and stony, escaping most of the miseries of life, also escapes joys. We do not want that. That is weakness. That is death. That soul has not been awakened, that never feels weakness and never feels misery. That is a callous state, and we do not want that. I have a return quote here from David Dieter, same book, The Way of the Superior Man. He puts it very, very well. He says this: closing down in the midst of pain is a denial of a man's true nature. A superior man is free in feeling and action, even amidst great pain and hurt. If necessary, a man should live with a hurting heart rather than a closed one. He should learn to stay in the wound of pain and act with spontaneous skill and love, even from that place. Right? Absolutely critical to face the emotions courageously. That doesn't just mean tolerating them. It means feeling them, allowing them to arise, and allowing them to pass away. Right? Back to our sociologist friend, Mr. Michael Flood, and he says this of men and masculinity. We need to redefine norms of manhood, but we also need to encourage men to invest less in gendered identities and boundaries, stop policing manhood, and embrace ethical identities that are less defined by gender. He says elsewhere, and on another occasion, being a good man is simply being a good person. Cool. I wanted to give this idea some airtime. I think there are problems with it, but this needs to be considered. It's part of the conversation. It's the way that some people see it. You might call this the kind of progressive standpoint. It makes a lot of sense. You could say that when we say men and masculinity, this is a function of the ego. It is egoic behavior, right? I am masculine, I am a man, and so on and so forth. Philosophically speaking, a lot of people would argue this is not really the goalpost. However, to illustrate the problem, I'd give you an analogy, and the analogy would be one of food. If we were to look at the ritual of food, and we were to look at this academically, purely logically, we would say the point of food is to nourish the body, right? That's all we're doing, nourishing the body. But that's not really true. There is an experience to food. There is a flavor to it. There is a texture to it. There is a ritual to it. It means something to it. There's a cultural element. It's even sacred from a certain point of view. There's an experience around it. It's important to us, right? It's not just a matter of nourishing the body. You can apply this same abstraction to masculinity. Yes, it's true. In the end of the day, you just need to be a good person, or better, something even beyond that. However, it's something like to be a man. There is a texture to it, there is an experience to it. There's a whole culture around it, a ritual. It's sacred from a certain point of view, right? And we risk, by trying to remove men from a homogeneic box, we risk putting them into a different box, let's say an androgynous box, or a box of no meaning and no purpose. It might not actually solve the problem. Consider this quote from this lady here. Her name is Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo. She was only the second woman in the West to be ordained as a Buddhist nun. And she says this about ego, which of course masculinity is egoic identification. Healthy ego in the form of healthy self-esteem is necessary to obtain prior to transcending ego. I'd like to introduce the idea of masculinity as a stepping stone, right? It's no doubt true that masculinity isn't really a goalpost in and of itself. However, fraternity and gallantry, self-awareness and self-control, having a community and a sense of self the way you can come to understand yourself, come to reflect upon yourself and develop critical skills for the regulation and mastery of yourself may enable you to eventually step into higher and finer things, whatever that may be, right? And I think practically speaking, that would be a necessary part of personal development, right? Before just moving straight away into something very fine and very spiritual and so forth, certainly in the society that I'm living in and the kind of men that I'm aware of. Let's take a different turn. Ladies first. Masculine virtue and honor. Now, I've got to say, this whole idea caught me off guard. See, I grew up in a very egalitarian and progressive household. My father, I have two sisters and a mother, so a very feminine household. My father was there, but he was working his ass off. He was working 6 days a week. He worked very, very hard to provide for us, and he did a fantastic job. But it was a very feminine upbringing, and certainly a very progressive upbringing. And therefore, in this Western culture, in a progressive environment, the idea of virtue being gendered was entirely anathema to my worldview. It didn't even occur to me that it would be gendered. And boy, was I wrong. Boy, was I naive. That's not even remotely true. For the greater part of human history, virtue has absolutely been a gendered thing because, of course, the expectations of men and women were totally different. And therefore, what was considered to be a good man and a good woman were fundamentally different. I'd like to spend some time talking about masculine virtue and honor. And we're going to start here by looking at this F-22 Raptor. We're going to take a little detour, but I'll bring it back on track. So the F-22 Raptor is the jewel in the crown of the American Air Force. It is their state-of-the-art weapon. They designed it in the 1990s. It entered service in the 2000s. It is still to this day unparalleled in its military prowess. I say that, however, the kill count of the F-22 Raptor is 0. It's 0 because they've never deployed it. And they've never deployed it because if they were to deploy it and one were to get shot down or one were to crash, they would risk that technology getting into the hands of the enemy, and that is a risk they just won't take, except for a very large and very important conflict with a superpower that they simply haven't had yet. The F-22 guarantees the Americans air superiority should something happen. And you only speak to the Germans or the Japanese about what happens when the Americans achieve air superiority. It is an ace up the sleeve that the Americans keep for power. Now, this is a horse. And this is a pointy stick. Okay? You put these things together and you get this. The French word for a horse is un cheval. A horseman is un chevalier. From these words in English, we get the word chivalry. Right? Believe it or not, these two things have something in common. These two things in their day were state-of-the-art weapons. Let's say you'd like to maintain a system of government. Maybe it's a monarchy, Maybe it's a theocracy, maybe it's a democracy, maybe it's a totalitarian dictatorship, maybe it's a banana republic. It doesn't matter. They're all the same. They need one thing: power. Top to bottom. You have to have control and regulation of rules and laws and taxation and so forth, top to bottom. You need people to do what you want them to do. And there are two ways to get someone to do what you want them to do. One is intrinsic motivation. You get them to regulate their own behavior, and that can absolutely work. Say, for example, here in Australia, there's about one police officer for every 1,000 civilians. One police officer cannot possibly control 1,000 civilians. They don't need to, because mostly Australians just regulate themselves. The other way of regulating another person's behavior is extrinsic motivation. Put simply, the carrot and the stick. You give them what they want, or you punish them. This is the stick, right? But there's an asymmetry here, and this is very, very important. No one else can build an F-22 Raptor. It takes a military-industrial complex going back hundreds of years and unprecedented military investment in order to produce such a machine. Any moron can get a stick and get on the back of a horse and call themselves a warlord. And indeed they have. That's a serious problem if, like I said, you'd like to set up a banana republic, a monarchy, a theocracy, a democracy, whatever it is, a kleptocracy, whatever it is you want. That's going to be an issue. So here's the fundamental question. How do you get men to do what you want them to do? And the answer for the longest time in human history across all cultures has been this: masculine honor codes. You encourage intrinsic motivation from the sense of basically men regulating their own behavior to pursue a perceived good. If they do that, you don't have to control them extrinsically. One that you're no doubt familiar with, if you're in the West, would be the idea of chivalry. Right? It is from the European tradition, and it had the following cardinal virtues. However, an important thing to understand is that chivalry is not an isolated phenomenon. The word for a knight in Hispanic culture is caballero, and the analog to chivalry is caballerosidad. Right? It started in Spain and in Portugal, but it was sent out to South America through their colonialization and so forth. It's not just isolated to Western or European cultures. You can see it here in Bushido. There is the Japanese warrior culture. You'll see its cardinal virtues. There's a lot of overlap here. There's a lot of ideas that are very similar between the cultures. Not isolated there either. If we go to the Middle East, el furusilla, you see this word at the top here, manliness, murua, makes its comeback here. Again, very similar cardinal virtues. These are very similar systems that were designed to regulate the behavior of boys and men. These were the cardinal virtues. Strength, number one. Not just physical strength, but even an emotional strength. The word rectitude comes up a lot. That means like hardiness or toughness, and also like a moral fiber or righteousness. Courage in adversity. Again, men have always been considered to be needed to be strong and courageous. This is the center of the bullseye, however, of honor cultures. Benevolence. What happens, and this is primarily what honor codes are concerned with. What happens when power intersects with the powerlessness, right? Now this starts with the physical setup between men and women, right? There is a power disparity. What do we do in that space? But it's not just there. How does your landlord treat the tenant, right? How does the king treat his people? How do the politicians respond to their constituents? Right, wherever there is a power dynamic, this is where honor is primarily concerned, right? Honor in all matters, including women, children, and elderly, even with respect to enemies, right? This permeated all things. This bloke's name is Habib Saloom, and he actually wrote a bunch of cookbooks. He's not really a philosopher. I'm calling him a philosopher because what he was really interested in doing was transporting Middle Eastern culture, Arab culture into the West in a nice way, in a compatible way. And at one point he talks about chivalry, and he says this: the noble and gentle ideals of chivalry were present among the Arabian desert warriors long before they flourished in the West. This is because chivalry is not the exclusive property of one culture, one class, or one religion. as honor, compassion, and dignity are universal, elemental aspects of human decency. Right? This is something that cultures have been doing again and again and again to get the outcomes that they need. Right? We do have some modern honor codes in this society. We do see echoes of this to this day. In the military, there's the oath of enlistment. In the police, the affirmation of service. In the lawyer, they pass the bar and have an allegiance of office. Doctors have the Hippocratic Oath, and of course we do bestow upon them a special title. We call them doctor, which is an honorary title. It lifts the status of the profession. And look, I'll concede, not a perfect system. It's also the case with members of parliament. I'll concede, not perfect, but that is the idea. The idea of these honor codes was to make it the responsibility taken seriously, and that this would lift the status of the profession, that people would regulate their behavior in the way that you wanted. Interestingly, as an aside, if you consider these professions, at least the top 3 or 4, you'll see these professions, okay, they're no longer masculine anymore, but for the longest time in human history they were. They were by men, for men, for the execution of masculine duty, and you will see in them a very high yang energy, right? They are not at all egalitarian, they are deeply hierarchical, right? They're even dressed the same, right? Because there can be no creativity at all, right? No one's allowed to have any individuality. You shave your head, you all wear a uniform. Even the way they move, it's rigid, right? You know, they're marching and they're saluting and yes, sir. It's all very firm, very rigid, very masculine. This is what happens when institutions have imbued lots and lots of yang energy over thousands and thousands of years. All of this would have been to a purpose. Yang energy provides stability and structure, and that would have been absolutely critical when dealing with enormous amounts of responsibility, right? But it's not at all creative, it's not at all soft, and it's not at all kind. Indeed, when these institutions go too far, they tend to lead to exactly what the Taoists identified, tyranny, right? They become tyrannical. There's also coming of age rituals, right? This is the point. A coming of age ritual identifies when a boy becomes a man. And again, you see this all throughout human history in different cultures and different religions and so forth. In Jewish culture, it's the bat mitzvah. It's 13 for boys. Christian had confirmation at about the same time. Australian Aboriginals had the walkabout. Sikhism had the dasta bandi. Shinto is the Japanese religion, Genpuku. And even in secular Japanese culture, the Seijin Shiki, which developed after the Japanese emperor had to abdicate after the Second World War. And in German secular culture, the Jugendwehen at a similar age. Now, the idea of coming of age culture seems to be something like this. There is an emphasis on the heavy responsibility that's conferred on the newly coming of age, a teaching of critical life skills, and they're charged to respect and help one another, and most importantly, a communication of societal expectations. Now, these things did exist for girls too, but there's an asymmetry there. You see, nature has a way of informing a girl that she is now a woman. It is very violent and it's incontrovertible. You are now a woman, right? Now, it was ritualized as well. It was made part of tradition to communicate the same things, but it's not entirely analogous. You see, androgens are the hormones that are responsible for the secondary sex characteristics in adult male vertebrates. Human beings are a vertebrate. The masculinization of the creature. These hormones, these androgens, take a long time. Masculinity is a slow burn, whereas femininity is more like the blooming of a flower, right? It takes a while to build a man. So at some point, societies had to decide at what point do we bestow upon the boys the responsibility, right, and the honor that would come along with this of becoming a man, right? There's a problem with all this, my friends. God is dead. Long live God. Now, to be clear, I'm not religious. I'm not trying to shove a religion down your throat. That's not my point in bringing this up. We don't believe in God in this culture anymore, by and large. God has been dying a slow death. Here's how this is relevant. Honor essentially died at the same time. It went out with the same construct. In this culture, we don't believe in things unless we can measure them. If I can't see it and I can't feel it or I can't measure it, then how do I know that it exists, right? On one hand, that makes sense, but on the other hand, it really doesn't. By way of example, consider the Australian dollar. The Australian dollar was invented in 1967. Prior to 1967, there was $0, right? That's because the Australian dollar is a product of our collective imagination, a figment of our imagination. And yet, everyone in Australia is marching along to the beat of the Australian dollar. We make it real with our minds, right? It does point to something. It points to the behavior of a bunch of people on a landmass that we call Australia. Again, Australia is an arbitrary construct. Not everyone agrees Australia exists. Just ask the Aboriginals, right? And it does point to some resources on that landmass, but ultimately it is a figment of our imagination, just like debt, right? We make it real with our minds. So too it is with honor. Yes, in the end of the day, honor is an imaginary construct, but we can make it real with our minds. And here's the salient point of this. For the longest time in human history, honor was the most powerful handle that the cultures had over the regulation of the behavior of boys and men, right? Because as I mentioned earlier in the talk, critically, most men would rather face certain death than shame. Right? Most men would rather face certain death than shame. This is a very powerful handle. Now, it's not obvious to me exactly what this looks like, but what is obvious to me is that we've totally taken our hand off of this handle as a society, and the correct measure is not 0. The wise measure of honor is not 0. This is a powerful tool that we could potentially bring back. Consider in this culture, when a boy turns 18, we say, okay, at this point you're a man. What does it mean? I don't know, son. Now you can buy beer, right? Now you can go to a pub. That's about it, right? It is small wonder that we are having problems. This guy's name is Tamler Summers. He wrote a book called Why Honor Matters. He's a contemporary philosopher in Canada, and he said, properly channeled, honor encourages virtues like courage, integrity, and solidarity, and gives a sense of living for something larger than oneself. This is exactly what's missing for the phenomena of men and masculinity in the 21st century. There is really no point. There is no sense of living for something larger than yourself. It isn't meaningful to be a man. It isn't meaningful to be masculine, and so the institution is decaying. Nicomachean ethics. Nicomachean ethics were an Aristotelian idea, and he said this in summary. Virtue exists as a mean state between the vicious extremes of excess and deficiency. Oh my God, I don't actually expect you to understand that. It's actually a simple enough idea, but he was an excellent philosopher and not a very good teacher. But I'll break it down into a language that even my generation can understand. It goes like this, ready? That's too little, right? That's too much. Oh yeah, baby, that's perfect. Okay, so I'd like to overlay this philosophy from Aristotle over the idea of masculinity. And I'm going to introduce the concept of spectral masculinity or masculinity on a spectrum. It's simple enough. Consider this. Take a virtue, an easy virtue. Let's take strength. Okay, so being deficient would be weak. Being excessive would be overbearing. We need people to be strong. All right? Okay, so you don't want too little of the thing and you don't want too much. You need to be somewhere in the middle. Take an example like bravery. Well, to not be brave enough is to be a coward, but to be too brave, you would say that you're foolish, right? We need you to be brave. And this works with just about any virtue that you might identify, right? Whatever virtue you may identify will be on a spectrum, right? It'll either be deficient or excessive or somewhere in the middle. And it's not up to me to determine what you might like to be. Okay, ultimately this is a personal choice. What kind of man you'd like to be is up to you. And I don't want this talk to be prescriptive, but I do want to provide a framework, and I'll do so by illustrating a problem. Here's where I think we go wrong as men. We do this, right? This is not more masculine. There tends to be this idea that We identify a trait that we consider to be masculine, something that we like about ourselves or we like about masculinity, and we double down and triple down and quadruple down on that thing. We want to be as strong as possible and brave as possible and to temper our emotions as much as possible. And that's not actually the healthy measure, right? This is more masculine, right? And hey, there's a bunch of virtues here. You can choose totally different virtues, it doesn't matter, but know this, whatever virtue that you choose, that you want to pursue, know that this is, the measure in this is the true measure of the masculinity. As Eckhart Tolle puts, the middle way, always the middle way, okay? There's always a measure to these things. The Cartesian loop of inevitable misogyny. Okay, this is kind of a joke. The idea is serious, but the delivery is a little bit of a joke. I'm poking fun at some of these highfalutin terms that come out of academic institutions now, where they're really ripping on men. I'm kind of poking fun at that. But the idea is a serious enough idea. Here's the idea. We need to identify a positive masculinity. Okay, we want something aspirational that boys and men can aim for. Okay, so we identify something positive, a positive trait or a characteristic, like, I don't know, for example, I'll say strength and courage, the two big ones. And you say, wow, isn't it great how strong men can be? Isn't it wonderful how courageous men can be? Well, invariably the mind does this thing where it can go to a place and say, it interprets that women don't have that trait. What are you saying? That women aren't strong? Are you saying that women aren't brave? I know loads of women who are strong. I know loads of women who are brave. And what happens in that moment is the trait falls out of the Overton window. The Overton window being what is socially acceptable to say and not say, right? And then guess what? We're right back here where we started. Right, the inevitable loop of misogyny. You're back to the beginning where you can't say anything positive about boys and men without tacitly inferring something negative about women. There is a solution to this problem, but we need to rejig the way that we think, reframe the conversation entirely to do so. I'll let Richard Reeves introduce the idea. He's a contemporary social commentator on this matter, a sociologist if you like. He says quite simply, don't compare men to women, compare men to boys, right? This conversation doesn't have to have anything to do with women, right? Women and femininity are separate phenomena, right? It's not about men and masculinity. It's like, well, what do you mean by boys? What do you mean by man? How do we delineate those things? He says this is a suggestion. Mature men are surplus generators. Boys become men when they produce more than they consume. Simply, it's like Schwarzenegger said, when you become useful. When you are giving back more than you take. As Rudyard Kipling says, then you'll be a man, my son, right? There's many ways that you can be useful, many ways that you can give. The classic one, of course, is your financial support, all right? And that's useful, but you can give physical support, you can give emotional support, you can be a beacon for men and masculinity within your community. You can be strong and loving and supportive when someone passes away, or when people lose their job, or just facing the day-to-day challenges of life. You can be a symbol for someone, right? Things can be placed upon your shoulders, right? And this is absolutely meaningful, right? All of this is to say that this is a matter of mature versus immature masculinity rather than, say, positive masculinity or toxic masculinity. If society says to us that it needs us to man up, it's not that they need you to be less like a woman, it's that they need you to be less like a child, right? Men are capable of regulating their emotions. Children cannot regulate their emotions. Children get upset about trivial things, right? They don't have their eye on the horizon, they don't have discipline and so forth, they don't have temperance. You don't want to be like this. You want to have measured masculine attributes that serve some purpose. This could be considered to be useful. Again, I'm not going to say what those attributes are. It's not for me to prescribe to you what masculinity means to you, but whatever you choose, know that it exists upon a spectrum, and this has nothing to do with comparing men to women or masculinity to femininity. They can be entirely separate phenomena in our analysis and in our worldview. Finally, I have a quote here from Christine Ember. She is a journalist for the Huffington Post, a progressive newspaper in the United States, but she said here on Big Think, on masculinity, if we actually want to help men who are in crisis, we have to come up with a positive vision of masculinity, one that is aspirational and not denigrating. We have to channel these masculine traits to be pro-social, Positive masculinity means using traits that feel distinctive to men for the good of others, for the good of society and the whole. This isn't a zero-sum game as the sexes rise and fall together. Thank you very much, Christine. That's very well put. Finally, and in summary, here are some potential pathways forward, summarizing everything we've discussed. Firstly, don't compare men to women, compare men to boys. Boys become men when they generate surplus, when they give more than they take. Reconsider the role of strength and courage, right? How does it apply in a modern context? Perhaps it's the capacity to remain light-hearted in adversity, or maybe it's simply the capacity to be useful. It's true that society expects strength and courage from men, but what exactly does that look like in a modern context? Masculinity as a proxy or a stepping stone. Masculinity may not be a goalpost in and of itself, but a sense of fraternity, a sense of gallantry, a sense of chivalry, a sense of belonging, self-awareness and self-control. Building this masculine identity may be a useful set of tools, physical, emotional, and spiritual, that might allow us to step on to higher and greater things. Restoring honor. Coming of age rituals, oaths, declarations, titles that can be earned and lost. Now, I don't know exactly what this looks like. You have to tread very lightly with honor. The subject is fraught, but it is very, very powerful. And we are potentially leaving some power on the table here on how to maximize whatever it is that we want to maximize as a society and as men. Some recommended reading, in particular, Why Honor Matters, that very first book there, that's critical to understanding the idea. But there's a whole bunch of extra books that were instrumental in bringing this talk together, amongst others. This will perhaps be circulated as a PDF at some point. At this point in the talk, there was a question section, which of course is not relevant to this format, but finally a quote to inspire us on our way. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Just be one. So that, my friends, was the hour-and-a-half talk. I hope that you found it informative. Again, I apologize that the audio was not delivered on the day. This was a clumsy mistake. We will do better in future. However, I hope the information got to you eventually and that you found it informative and useful. By all means, feel free to send any questions or comments or complaints through to my email, and I'll do what I can to address them, seeing as you missed out on that element of the talk. I'll try to address those questions as best I can. On behalf of the school, thank you very, very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. Bye for now.